Okay, great. So as we all know, deep learning has become really important in scientific computing and physics-based modeling, and it's found a wide range of applications. But there are two key challenges when you want to apply deep learning to scientific problems. The first one has to do with interpretability, and interpretability is important because you want to, at the end of the day, understand the systems that we're studying, and it's also useful in debugging our models, and at the end of the day, provides trust in the models that we want to deploy. And the second challenge has to do with a generalization to out-of-distribution data, or really extrapolation. And I would argue that that's also desirable at some level, especially when we want to deploy our models. Sometimes in some applications, we don't exactly know the boundaries of our training landscape. So it's desirable to have some level of robustness to some level of extrapolation. So, and there's also evidence in the literature that the more interpretable models typically tend to generalize better. So in this specific talk, I'm going to be focusing on interpretability. So that brings us to the field of XAI, explainable AI. We can divide it into two classes of problems. We have the by design problems where we integrate interpretability from the beginning into the architecture of our machine learning model, so by construct. And then we have the post hoc approach where we take an opaque neural network, we probe it, generate data from it, and in a post-processing step, we interpret the opaque neural network. So in this talk, I'm going to be focusing on by design interpretable AI. And my goal today is going to be discovering nonlinear relationships, either analytically from the data or by designing new architectures that are interpretable. And the vision is going to be using building blocks of neural networks. So essentially what's made neural networks successful, so things like global optimization, additive, we want to use this technology with minimal reliance on those opaque neural networks themselves. So in order to get the interpretability that we desire. So that's going to be the vision. Okay, so this is an outline for my talk. I'm going to show you three applications. The first one is going to be dynamical system identification. The second one, interpretable nonlinear reduced order modeling. And finally, interpretable operator learning. And this three parts of the talk, the three stories I'm going to tell you today are going to be motivated by three key equations in scientific machine learning. So I would argue that these three equations are very important equations in machine learning. So one is sparse regression, the other one is PCA, and finally is a simple functional linear model. These equations are really fundamental and important in scientific machine learning. But what we're going to be doing today is that we're going to be looking at these equations and asking ourselves, can we do better using the modern computing technology we have, such as PyTorch? Can we do better than these equations? And can we do better in an interpretable manner? So that's going to be the three stories that I'll be telling you today. So let's start with sparse regression. The problem here is that we have some data, typically trajectories of our system, and the goal is to use that data to build an analytical equation, typically systems of differential equations that match our data. So we can use deep learning to approximate our data, but that's not an interpretable approach. So on the interpretable side, we can use either symbolic regression, or we can use the popular SINDy approach, sparse identification of nonlinear dynamics, which I'll talk about. And a motivating problem, which is a very new research direction in my group, is actually cancer systems pharmacology and digital twin modeling. And the idea here is that, from patients that have cancer, we can get their samples from their tumor, and we can do in vitro testing to obtain subcellular protein concentration data, as well as cell scale data using methods like cell sequencing and proteomics. And the question you want to ask is that, can we develop computational models that can take this type of data and fit governing equations to them? Because once we have mechanistic governing equations, then we can use them to optimize treatment, which is an open problem in cancer. So specifically, I'm going to be focusing on subcellular signaling modeling. So that's going to be finding a systems of nonlinear ODE represented by a network. And then that's going to be coupled to a cell scale model, which represents the interaction between different cell phenotypes. Okay. So, but before we get there, so the question is going to be, can we build these mechanistic models from input data? So So now the approach we're going to be using is going to be SINDy. And if we look at the alternative approach, symbolic regression, so symbolic regression takes data and essentially it searches for all mathematical expressions and their composition to fit the data. So this is really, it's an expensive problem. It uses typically genetic algorithms to do the global optimization and sometimes leads to complicated expressions. On the other hand, we have the SINDy approach, which is a much more structured approach to finding governing equations from data. And the way it works is that you provide a library of candidate terms, so the analytical terms that you think could be important, and then it formulates a convex optimization through a sparse regression and finds the governing equation from data. Now, the problem with SINDy is that if you have nonlinear parameters like Fourier frequencies, growth decay rates, like exponential bandwidths, you need to know these nonlinear parameters beforehand. And that's challenging to guess or know. So in ADAM-SINDy, the way we approach it is that we shift the convex optimization problem to a global optimization problem with ADAM optimization. And we also learn those nonlinear parameters. So we don't need to guess the nonlinear parameters. And also we do a fully adaptive a sparsity promoting strategy, which, as I'll explain later, gives us machine precision accuracy. Okay, so this is a review of the SINDy framework. So the idea is that you have a system of governing equations. You have the solution, so you can measure the solution. So you know x as a function of time, so you already have your answer. And then your goal is to find a governing equation, to find f of x. You build a library theta of candidate terms. So any candidate term you think are possibly important, you throw it at the library. And the challenge is that if you have nonlinear parameters like powers, frequencies, and exponential bandwidths. If you have these types of parameters, you need to guess them in your library or include a range of values in your library. And then you solve this sparse regression problem to select a sparse set of these candidate terms, linearly add them together, find their coefficients, and represent that as your model. So typically, the sparsity strategy in SINDy is an identity matrix for gamma. So you uniformly penalize for sparsity on all your candidate terms. So now, our approach, ADAM-SINDy, there are two key differences in ADAM-SINDy. The first one is that we also make the nonlinear parameters trainable. So we don't guess the nonlinear parameters, we solve for them through the ADAM optimization. So that's the first big difference. The second big difference is that we don't do uniform sparsity. This gamma matrix that imposes sparsity, we define it in a candidate-wise manner. So every term can have its own penalization, and then we learn that as we go. So that's the two key differences. And to formulate the problem, we have two strategies. We can either do a min-max optimization or a joint minimization approach. And what we've learned after going back and forth between these two approaches is that the min-max optimization is more difficult to converge. It requires like tricks like weight decay, but the min-min approach is much more robust. And the min-min approach works because what happens is that the adaptive sparsity parameter, you might think that because you're minimizing everything, doesn't it just go to zero? But the interesting thing is that it goes to zero for correct terms, but it converges to a constant value for incorrect terms. And this is what we see in all the test cases that we investigate. And that is actually why we get machine precision accuracy in ADAM-SINDy. So if you take a closer look, this is the optimization problem we're solving. And because it's a minimization problem, it drives the sparsity promoting parameter gamma towards zero. And what that happens is that the L1 sparsity promoting term goes away. You only left with your data fidelity term. So you do a perfect machine precision fit to your data. But then for the incorrect terms, what happens is that because the coefficient goes to zero and you do thresholding, you zero it out, then the gradient becomes zero, so it doesn't change anymore. It just saturates to a non-zero value. So that's the trick why ADAM-SINDy works so well. Okay, so the strategy is that we're penalizing only the incorrect terms while we spare the correct ones. And that helps us get very accurate results. So we have looked at multiple problems. I'm just, in the interest of time, going to focus on a couple. So this is the so-called ABC flow problem. So this is the ground truth equation. It's an incompressible flow. So you can think of this as XYZ velocity. And it's a benchmark problem in chaotic advection. It's an incompressible flow. And we actually took this benchmark problem and we made it even more complex by making the frequencies different for every term. So now, if you look at the classical SINDy method, so this is SINDy with knowing the exact frequencies. If you happen to know exactly the nonlinear parameters in a system, the classical SINDy method works perfectly fine. No problem with that. But if you don't know the exact frequencies, which is the case in 99% of the problems, and you guess them, and your guess is not right, which again is very likely, you get a dense system like this, which doesn't match the ground truth. But in ADAM-SINDy, we can optimize for it. So we can solve for it. So we find not just the coefficients, but also the frequencies. And you can see I'm placing pi here, not the digits, because we actually find this frequency up to machine precision accuracy because of what I just explained. Okay, we can also do this for PD problems. This is a wildfire transport problem. This is a nonlinear advection diffusion reaction problem. So you have a reaction term that's nonlinear, that has a nonlinear parameter. So in Paula's talk, you also had a reaction term. We had a reaction term there too, but there it was a linear reaction. But in some applications, we have nonlinear reactions that makes it more challenging to infer the parameters. But again, we can see that ADAM-SINDy can find these nonlinear reaction as well. Okay, so now back to our cancer motivation problem. So this is the ground truth equation, how it looks for cancer. It's a large subcellular systems of ODE. These are all nonlinear ODEs that you can summarize in this diagram here, what they represent, reaction between different proteins. You have these Michaelis-Menten terms, which gives it nonlinear, and that's coupled to the cell scale model. So here we have resistant cells that are resistant to drug, sensitive cells, and differentiated cells. And the output of this cell scale model tells us how much cancer grows, okay? So now we take data, in this case, it's a clean synthetic experimental data. We do different sorts of perturbations to generate data. And then we want to take the trajectories of this data. And our goal is to find these equations that you see on the right-hand side. Okay, so this is much more complicated than the benchmark problems I just presented. Okay, now here's the challenge. In systems biology, a lot of these trajectories of these different states are correlated. So that makes system identification very, very difficult in biology, okay? So now we were not able to do a one-shot identification like the benchmark problems I presented. So what we did was a two-stage approach. We took the data, we applied ADAM-SINDy to it, and that gave us a clue to eliminate a bunch of candidate terms. Then we took the remaining terms, and what we did from there was that we basically looked into all different combinations of the remaining terms and just did a simple nonlinear regression there, and used the AIC score to select the best model. Okay, and what we saw was that ADAM-SINDy could reduce the total number of models that we had to test by 90%. Okay, so this is some representative results. So these are some of the states. These are some true equations, and these are the equations that we find. For the 18 proteins, in 100% of the time, we were able to find the correct governing equation. But since in this second stage we used nonlinear least squares, we had some error in the parameters. So we had up to 1% error in the parameters that we found. Okay, so now let's go to the second part of my talk, which is about nonlinear reduced order modeling. So in this part, I'm going to be focusing on this very, very simple equation, PCA, Machine Learning 101. If you take any machine learning class, this is where it all starts, this simple, beautiful PCA equation. Okay, and the motivation for PCA in scientific machine learning really all started with reduced order modeling, and I would argue in fluid flow, probably in the 80s. And in fluid mechanics, we call it POD. And we take a spatiotemporal data, U as a function of space and time, and POD gives us this beautiful decomposition in space and time. Linear, beautiful, as simple as we can get to find a reduced order model. Well, but you can argue that in complex problems, you need many modes, right? So then you have the autoencoders, neural networks, where you do this in a latent space. It gives you more accuracy, fewer modes, but you have challenges in interpretability. And also you can't get both latent space in both time and space. Okay, so we talk about those challenges here in this paper. And there's some effort, of course, to fit a dynamical system in the latent space by some groups. But the method that we propose is another strategy. We call it DESMO, decomposed sparse model optimization. And the idea is that I want to get POD-like interpretability. I want to get equations that look like this, as beautiful as this, but with better accuracy. So that's my goal. Okay, I don't want to use neural networks. No neural network here. So can I do that? Can I extend POD to nonlinear equations by keeping the analytical form? So Again, this is motivated by what I talked. We have SINDy, we have ADAM-SINDy, which, ADAM-SINDy, the motivation was to do global optimization, find the nonlinear parameters. We also have this other global optimization strategy, which I really like, optimizing a discrete loss, ODIL, where it's an alternative to PIN, where you have discretized finite difference equations, and you optimize all the stencils in a global optimization setting using ADAM optimization. So now, Desmo sits somewhere in between. It's kind of motivated by all these techniques. And here's the idea. In PCA, I have my spatial temporal system. I decompose it into some spatial modes and temporal equations. I get an equation that's as beautiful as this for 4 modes. Now, what if I want to be more accurate? Now, this is where Desmo comes. So what I do in Desmo is that I take, like, for example, 2 base POD modes. So here I have phi1 and phi2. And then I say, OK, I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to build the nonlinear extensions of phi1 and phi2. This is all the nonlinear extensions that you're seeing here. And what I'm going to do is that I'm going to do sparse regression. OK, so I'm going to solve this sparse regression problem. I'm going to pick some of these nonlinear terms. OK, I'm going to learn which ones to pick to, at the end of the day, get an analytical equation that looks like this in space and time that's building off of my base POD modes. And those base POD modes could also be evolved during the optimization. And I'm finding some nonlinear extensions to them. OK, so that's my goal. I want to replace this with this one. OK, so now here's an example of a flow over a cylinder. So in this example, I took 2 base POD modes, phi1 and phi2, so these 2 guys, and I built and I searched using sparse optimization with Adam. I searched for nonlinear extensions of them. OK, and ultimately what I get is something like this. This is the final equation that I get. So you can think of this as an analytical equation representing your spatial temporal system. And what I find is that I only had the base POD mode 1 or 2 that I initialized, but I find with my nonlinear method, I find the higher order POD modes as a functions of the base POD modes, slightly per term. OK, so I'm able to discover the higher order POD modes without even using them, using this technique. And when I compare the errors, I can see that with Desmo and 2 base modes, I can get the same error as POD with 4 modes, which should make sense based on what I just said. OK, we can also do this in more complex problems. This is blood flow in a brain aneurysm. So I do a lot of blood flow problems in my group. This is a chaotic pulsatile spatial temporal system. And we can get an equation that looks like this. So this is with 4 base modes. I can get an equation that represents my spatial temporal data. So in this example, what we see is that we find some new modes that do not necessarily look like higher order POD modes. OK, now the problems I have here are periodic in time. So what I can also do, I can enforce the temporal coefficients to follow a Fourier series. So if I do that, I'm going to in the previous approaches for the temporal coefficients, I'm optimizing them. I'm finding them in every time step. If I want, I can fit an equation to them as well. That's easy. But another approach would be to use a Fourier series for them. So because the problems I presented to you are periodic in time. If I do that, it's going to give me less parameters to optimize. I'm going to now only optimize for frequencies and the coefficients. And by construct, I'm going to be periodic in time. So once I compare all the methods, I see that Desmo Fourier gives me less error. But in terms of interpretability, it generates more terms compared to the baseline Desmo method. So finally, if you want to couple this to a neural network, it's possible. All of this is in PyTorch. It's compatible with neural networks. So we also tried, instead of initializing the spatial modes with POD, find them with an autoencoder. And this is a special type of autoencoder that does it in space. And we train everything, Desmo and the autoencoder, end to end. So it's all trained together. OK, so that's also another way to go about it. OK, so the final part of my talk is going to be about interpretable operator learning. And here, I'm going to be looking at this integral operator equation. OK, so I'm going to be motivated by this equation. And can I do better from this equation? So in operator learning, the problem is that we're doing mapping between data, but in function spaces. So a typical neural network, when you want to map f of x to u of x, you discretize them. You essentially lose the information in x. So x is gone. You just discretize f and u, and you let the neural network map it. But the idea in operator learning is that you want to keep the information in x. You want to keep the function form when you do the mapping between your data. And the simplest way you can think about it is this linear integral equation. Zeta here is a dummy variable that you integrate over. X is your free variable. Your goal is to learn this kernel K. Okay, you want to learn a kernel K, and you map it to U. And X, you can sample, once it's trained, you can sample any X you want. So you can do undersampling, you can do super resolution. So X, you could sample it. It's your free variable after you train and learn this K function. So there have been multiple operator learning architecture proposed. Many of them are motivated by this equation. For example, the popular FNO method takes this equation to the Fourier space and does it. DeepONet, if you look carefully into DeepONet, that one is also, there's a link between this equation. There are also other methods, MKN, KNO, and we also had a generalized functional linear model. And what we did in our approach was that we took a library of integral equations and then through sparse regression at it. So kind of like SINDy, combining SINDy with this equation to find the kernel K. Now, what about interpretability? So okay, if you want to, so the theme of my talk is interpretation. So how do I do that here? Two approaches. The first approach is that these are integral equations. So if you do it with integral equation approach, like the GFLM approach that we have, you can use the additive nature of integral equations, and you can decompose the contributions of different regions of your input data F to the output data. So this is one way to go about it, which you presented this, my student Mojgan presented this work at USACM. But today I'm going to show you a second way, a second strategy toward this, and that's interpretable latent space modeling by doing coarsening of your data. Okay, so think of X as a free variable. Okay, you're free to choose X however you want and sample train accordingly. That's the idea. Okay, so this is the architecture that we come to. This is differentiable autoencoding neural operator, or DINO. And the idea is that I have a high resolution grid that I want to solve some PDE problem. What I'm going to do is that I'm going to map it with an operator to a coarse grid. Okay, solve my problem on the coarse grid, and then go back to the high resolution grid. Okay, so that's the idea. You have a difficult problem. You want to learn how do you take the difficult problem, convert it to an easy problem, solve the easy problem, and then go back to your high resolution correct space. And you can do different applications of this. You can do nonlinear dimensionality reduction by defining the dimensional reduction as a coarsening operator, going from a high resolution grid to a coarse grid. You can do geometric reduction, convert a 2D problem to a 1D problem, and you can do many to one functional mapping. So in the applications I'm going to show you, the encoder, decoder are a combination of FNO and a convolutional downsampling upsample. Okay, so here's the first example. This is just static mapping. Okay, so I have flow over a cylinder, I have a high resolution grid, and I map it to a coarse grid. And I'm comparing it to other methods that can also be visualized in the latent space. So the key thing about our method is that this method, you can visualize the latent space. You don't get that in many methods, okay? You can visualize the latent space in space, okay? It's spatial visualization, not some modes that you don't have an easy interpretation of. So here you can actually plot the latent space and look at it because of the way we define this architecture. So this is exactly what I'm doing here. I'm looking at this latent space results, and what I see is that if I compare this to like another method, CNO, which also gives us interpretable latent space, because I'm defining this as a coarsening operator, my latent space is actually physically meaningful. I can see the rotating, the clockwise, counterclockwise rotating vortices for flow over cylinder, whereas in CNO, you lose that type of information in your latent space. Now, the more interesting application of this is not just data compression, but actually solving a problem in the latent space. So here I'm placing a differentiable PDE solver on the latent space, and I'm training this whole thing together, okay? Now, the idea is this. This differentiable PDE solver is going to be dealing with a coarser grid, so that's easier. Number two, I can place a lower fidelity version of my PD in the latent space. For example, if I have the full 2D momentum transport equation, I can place a linearized vortex transport equation here. I can place an inviscid a diffusion equation here. I can represent different versions, even a 1D equation in the latent space. So I'm going to see how it's all will look. How will my latent space look if I place a low fidelity PDE in the latent space? And this is the results. What we see is that if I do a 2D inviscid vorticity transport equation, sorry, this should be vorticity transport equation, and a 1D version in the axial direction, I can preserve the coherent vertical structures, okay? But if I do like a Stokes type equation, which is just diffusion, I get something that looks like this in the latent space. So now, I argue that this is still interpretable. So this method is always interpretable. And definition of interpretable, I can look at it and visualize it. Is this physically meaningful? No. So if I put in a model that doesn't have the fidelity in the latent space, I get something that's physically irrelevant, but I can still visualize that. I can visualize that. I understand what my model is doing. But if I put a more higher fidelity model, I get structures in the latent space that preserve the main physics of my problem. And I can compare the accuracy of all these methods on test data. And at the end of the day, the latent space interpretability in this approach is governed by the PDE that I place in the latent space. Okay? So the final example I want to show here is that we can do also geometric reduction. So here's a 2D blood flow problem. I can take a 2D grid and I can convert the 2D problem to a 1D problem in the latent space by sampling X, okay? So here I'm learning how to go from a 2D transport problem to a spatially averaged reduced order 1D equation. So it's a geometrically reduced order model. And I have the 1D vorticity transport equation along the axial direction in the latent space. And I can actually visualize the latent space. This is how it looks like. This is how the latent space evolves in time. It's just a function of X. This is how the latent space looks as a function of X. So I can look at it, I can visualize it, and then I can see how my results look. So this is here a nice problem where we can learn how to do geometric reduction. And finally, we can also do this in 3D problems. This is the 3D coronary artery example. We can also do, here we're doing the pressure Poisson equation. I'm not going to get into details, but this is to show you that we can also do this in a more complex 3D problem setting as well, where we solve a 3D PDE in the latent space. Okay, so to summarize, I've showed you that ADAM-SINDy, an enhanced version of SINDy, can enable simultaneous optimization of nonlinear parameters, and it can give you machine precision accuracy, at least in the benchmark problems, and gives you a more flexible framework for finding interpretable governing equations in an analytical form from data. So DESMO, the second part, was an adaptive nonlinear extension of POD, which gives you better accuracy, but it keeps the analytical form. You can still write it on a paper, and it does it with less base modes. Okay, it just searches for extensions of those base modes. And then finally, Dyno was an interpretable latent space differentiable solver that I can learn how do I take a complex problem, a high fidelity PDE on a high resolution grid, how do I convert it to a coarse grid and place a lower fidelity PDE and solve it there. And I can still visualize it. So it's all interpretable. I can visualize what I'm doing in my latent space. Okay, and the big picture here is that modern global optimization, together with differentiable programming, has really high potential for interpretable modeling of nonlinear systems. And in all of these methods that I showed you, they were all implemented in PyTorch. You can couple all of these with neural networks, with different types of modern approaches. So there's a lot of opportunities here for this type of model. So with that, I'd like to thank funding, and also the 3 parts that I presented, you can find them online. The second paper will be online very soon. And yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Amir, for the wonderful talk. It was really, really nice and informative. So now I guess I'd like to open it up for questions. Maybe I'll start with the questions that they are already on the chat. So Whiten is asking, what advantages does the ADAM-SINDy framework offer in terms of interpretability and computational cost when we compare to neural ODEs and pins?
Okay, so neural ODs and pin. So in neural OD and pin, in both of them, you need neural networks. Here, you don't need neural networks. Okay, so in neural ODs, in pins, you're optimizing, I would say, thousands, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of parameters. Here, you're only optimizing the coefficients and the nonlinear parameters. So how many parameters? Maybe on the order of 10 parameters, or depending on the complexity, or maybe 100 at most. Okay, so that's the first thing. You're optimizing far less parameters, and you're not using any neural network. So pins, you can do system identification with pin, but you need some clever tricks. You can't directly just use the vanilla pin for system identification. And also for neural operators, which we also worked on neural ODEs, you still you have some level of interpretability, but you're going to have a neural network as one of the terms, okay? So you're not going to have the full analytical form. So maybe you have some analytical forms in your equation, but then there's a neural network sitting in place of one of the terms. Maybe like your closure problem, right? So I would say for neural ODEs, it's semi-interpretable, right? Not fully interpretable. Yeah.
Thank you. So another question is coming from Kira, and he's asking, how sensitive is ADAM-SINDy to noise? More specifically, the final symbolic form itself, are they sensitive to change in data?
So very good question. So there's nothing that we found in ADAM-SINDy's architecture that provides any advantage compared to the basic SINDy approach related to noise. So if you want to use noise, I would say you could think about integrating ADAM-SINDy with the weak SINDy form, which is shown to be more robust to noise. You can do the integral equation, weak SINDy, and then apply ADAM-SINDy to it. And actually, we have a paper where we do something like that on integral equations in operators. That would be one way to go about it. So using the weak SINDy form and then applying ADAM-SINDy to it. And the other way would be that you deal with the noise filtering in a pre-processing step. But the ADAM-SINDy by itself doesn't give advantage. I think you have to couple it with weak SINDy to get some advantages, but that shouldn't be that difficult to do.
Okay. The other question in the chat is also coming from Whiten. Can the Desmo framework generalize to 3D flow through cylinder or unsteady turbulent regimes? I guess you touched
Yes.
on it a little bit, but maybe if you want.
So in Desmo, I showed you two examples. One of them was 3D spatiotemporal system. So the blood flow example I showed you was a 3D blood flow problem, but we do have a turbulence example in the paper. So I didn't present to you. So we took the Johns Hopkins turbulence database. We actually did a slice. So it's a 2D turbulence. So turbulent channel flow. So we took the turbulent channel flow from Johns Hopkins database, and we also showed that you can use DSM on turbulence data. So the paper should be online within a few days. It's accepted. It will be online in less than a few days. So you can see in the paper once it's online, the turbulence example that we applied.
Thank you. So that's it from the chat. So now if anybody has a question, just feel free to unmute yourself and ask directly.
Can I go ahead and ask a question?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Sushanta from Michigan Tech. Great talk, thank you. So I was wondering, I would like to interject on the point that you answered related to comparing against FNO and other type of physics informed model. So since what I understood from your work, that you are trying to solve the PD in lower dimension, or if you do POD, you need some data to start with.
Right, of course, of course. There's no free, of course, all of these, none of these are purely, all of these you need data. So the idea is that for a certain, and I want to caution everybody, you cannot extrapolate. You cannot extrapolate. Okay, these are, the first talk I presented, ADAM-SINDy, if you hit a mechanistic model, there you're good. Okay, if you're hitting a mechanistic model. But for this type of operator learning work, you cannot extrapolate. So you're absolutely right. And this is the case for all these methods. I'm yet to see something that can generalize to everything. So the idea is this: you have a certain class of problems, you have training data for that class of problem, and then you learn only for that specific class of problem, how do you convert it to a simpler problem? That's it. You cannot, there's no free lunch. You cannot do this for extrapolate to any class of problems.
I see. You answered very nicely. Thank you so much.
Yep.
Any other questions? Well, so I'm sure that I imagine Amir also is available if anybody has question, if they want to directly reach out to him. But I guess if there aren't any more questions, let's thank both of our wonderful speakers. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and talking about the advancement in the field. Thank you so much, and I guess enjoy the rest of the evening wherever you are in the world. For Paula, evening, and then for us, morning. Thank you so much. Have a good one, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.